Hello everybody, Peter Marzano here with my first album review of the channel. I know I said I was going to be doing this for a really long time, never actually got started on it, but now I'm finally going to get started on it. I hope to make this a semi-regular thing, and then I'll also adjust my channel to make sure that this stays separate from all of the sports videos. But today for my first review, my first retrospective review, I'll be starting at the top of the LP discography of currently arguably the world's most popular artist right now, former Degrassi star and current Toronto Raptors ambassador Drake, with his debut album in 2010, Thank Me Later. I'll be taking a look at that, and it's an album that I've certainly listened to a lot throughout high school, which is when I started listening to him. It is an artist that I certainly have listened to a decent amount throughout the time that he has been popular, but with his debut album, 14 tracks, and coming in at around 61 minutes, he was building off of the success that he had from first getting big into the mainstream, which was from a song off of his So Far Gone EP that came out in 2009, that being Best I Ever Had, which was a top 10 hit in the United States and certainly led to a lot of the hype surrounding this album, and that certainly impacts the lyrical matter that you see in it throughout, which either primarily involves around two subjects throughout this album, either his rising fame and his relationship with others in the industry, including those in Young Money, and also his relationship with women and heartbreak and insecurity and relationship problems are all discussed in this album at length, and it's something that really establishes the kind of persona that Drake takes on from that point on in his career. And in retrospect, you could really see it in his later work, that it's something that he's really worked to perfect over time. It's something he's gotten better at, and I certainly think after listening to this album, re-listening to this album, I should say, a couple of times, it's really led me to think of how far he's come from the beginnings of this, which was certainly a hit or miss album, to say the least. Starting off with the first track, Fireworks, with the Alicia Keys feature, I really don't think, especially in retrospect, that it's as urgent of an opener as what we see Drake do in the future from this point on, this album coming out in June of 2010. And while I do like the general lyrical subject matter around it, in the sense that I think it makes sense for the opening song of this album to kind of evolve around his relationship with fame and what it's like finally getting big in the music industry, and certainly something I think fits with the theme of the album, I just don't think that it's something that is that engaging to start off an album that you want to get into. So I do like the track for sure, but I definitely was a bit disappointed in the sense that, after re-listening to it, especially and comparing it to what Drake has come out with since, I definitely don't think that the opening part of this album is as strong as what we see in the future, particularly on his album right after this. The second track, Karaoke, I think takes on a theme that we see repeated a lot throughout the course of this album, which are these really slow, spacey instrumentals accompanied by Drake primarily singing, with maybe including a rap verse later on in the song. And I think Karaoke probably executes that concept the best of any of the other songs of that theme that are on the album. It's certainly better after listening to it a couple times too. It was one of those that was boring at first, but has certainly grown on me after listening to it a bit more. And I do think that the instrumental and the lyrical matter fit together in that song. I don't think that the production is great by any means in that track, but I certainly think it's something that is engaging enough and perhaps more entertaining than the first track on the album. However, that isn't really well translated to the third track, The Resistance, which kind of continues on that theme of these spacey, slower beats. The production just wasn't really engaging, and I don't think that Drake was really doing anything in tracks like this to make the songs any more engaging. And while I don't really think that he's really ever technically bad at any point in this album, whether that be with rapping or singing, I certainly think that he doesn't really do anything to set himself apart. And while I think that this album in retrospect has also been given a lot of praise for being influential, as this style of music has really gotten a lot bigger in the last 8 years, there have been a lot of artists that have taken advantage of this trend, I also think that what's overlooked is the influence that 808s and Heartbreak by Kanye West had on this style of music, and I think that that influence is very apparent on this album, specifically in the Resistance, where it's really slow. You get Drake singing a little bit, and there's also that little bit of 808's influence particularly reminded me of Say You Will, the opening track of that album, to where it's this ominous, repeating, yet slow synth beat going on. But I really didn't enjoy the track that much, and I think that after the first three songs, Drake, even though Karaoke I think is a really solid track, I don't think Drake or his production at that point had really done anything to make this an engaging album. I do think that that changes with Over, which is, I think, decisively the strongest track on the album to that point. I think it's the first beat on the album that is hard banging and really interesting. It makes you want to listen to it more right away, because I think a lot of times Drake's lyrical content doesn't really, especially at this point in his career, doesn't consistently draw in the way a production can, at least get people to listen to the song. But it's also the first time that Drake sounds urgent and confident when he's rapping. And I also think that that is something that he's made a big part of himself moving forward. But it was really only shown in flashes on his debut album. And I think he executes it a lot better later on in his career. But at this point in his career, at the beginning, it was really just, there's only a couple tracks in this album where he shows that kind of spunk that he does in Over. I think Show Me a Good Time is another solid track in the sense that the production does the heavy lifting, whereas the lyrical content is far from great in the song. But I also think that with the subject matter of it, with it just being a song kind of talking about Drake's relationship with women and, you know, just not trying to take anything too seriously, I think the beat does a great job of fitting with it. It was a good Kanye West production, one of the two songs that he produced on the album, but it's an enjoyable track, nothing that really blows you away, but something that I think picks off of the tone that Over set, as far as finally bringing these hard-hitting beats with confident and passionate rapping, something that Drake brings to the table in Show Me a Good Time. And I think that that's also continued in Up All Night, which I think is a really solid track that has a good Nicki Minaj feature. This was also before the major rise in her popularity, so it was something that certainly contributed to getting her career and popularity started. I think the production on this is also very strong. I think it could certainly do without the longer interlude. The song's essentially over after around 2.5 minutes. It goes a bit longer than it should, but it's just kind of this, you know, confident, brash, Young Money anthem, and I like it a lot. I actually think you can argue Nicki Minaj's verse is stronger than Drake's in the song. But after that, the album really starts to slow down a lot, both in terms of tempo and entertainment. Starting with Fancy, which is actually a really solid song to start with. The beat's engaging, the chorus is definitely annoying and repetitive, but Drake's first verse is really one of his best on the album. He has a really solid line and clever line on there where he says, referring to women that he's interested in, as long as they got a little class like half days, which I found to be funny. But the song is way too long. And the features on it of Swizz Beatz and T.I. are pretty unenjoyable, especially Swizz Beatz' very repetitive chorus. And then the song goes into this very slow, spacey interlude after the verses are done, and it's just way too drawn out. The song does not need to be 5 minutes and 19 seconds. And to me, at that point, it was probably the worst song in the album, but Drake unfortunately outdoes himself in that regard with the following track, Shut It Down, featuring The Dream, which is 6 minutes and 54 seconds long and is very slow, very unengaging. You know, features vocals by Drake over these, you know, synth-heavy, very slow, you know, 80 beats per minute beats. And it's just not engaging. And while I think some of the vocals are pleasant, I don't really think that it's anything that makes me want to listen to it anymore. And especially every time I've listened to this album, those two tracks specifically have felt laboring almost, to think that in the middle of the album you have 12 minutes, over 12 minutes, that take up these two songs that are just way longer than they need to be. Shut It Down especially, just a song that is very similar in concept and production to The Resistance, but double the length. And he really tried to make this very anthemic ending to the song, but it really just didn't land, and unfortunately makes it a major dry point on the album. But from that point on, Drake certainly recovers. The song Unforgettable with Young Jeezy, I like the feature to it. The hook is finally something that kind of maintains the momentum of the verses, and I think it's one of the better tracks on the later part of the album. I really like the song Light Up and actually Miss Me as well. The two songs that follow Unforgettable are very similar in the sense that you have Drake and a feature spitting these very long and impressive versus Jay-Z in the case of Light Up and Lil Wayne and Miss Me. But the problem with both of these tracks is that the chorus, unlike Unforgettable in that sense, even though I certainly think that the lyrical content in Light Up and Miss Me is much better, they're both pretty much about the same thing, just talking about confidence in the industry and confidence in becoming a bigger star. But with these two songs, there's these hard-hitting beats and these really, hard-hitting verses as well that are clever and really strong, but then they go into a chorus where it's Drake singing, the beat slows down a lot, and it just doesn't really carry the momentum of the verses through very well. And I think that that's something that Drake does a lot better of a job on in his future works. But in these two songs specifically, I think they really could have helped pick up the latter part of this album, but because their choruses just aren't quite as strong, they just don't land nearly as hard. But I think Light Up and Miss Me are both great lyrically, specifically Miss Me by Drake. I think Light Up is strong equally from both Drake and Jay-Z, but I think the production certainly could have been more urgent and Light Up. It was more of a subdued beat, but I think that's a song to where if you kind of amplify the bass and kind of add in a little more, it could have been a lot more engaging, and that's on top of the hook. But I do think that Miss Me, Drake drops another very hard-hitting verse, but the chorus and Lil Wayne's verse, despite a few lines, just doesn't really help carry that kind of energy through. And then he comes out with another snooze fest with the third to last track on the album, that being Cece's Interlude, which also sounds very similar to The Resistance and Shut It Down, with another slow, synth-heavy instrumental with him singing over it. Luckily, it is just an interlude and doesn't really make too much of an impact on the album, but I think Drake closes the album incredibly strong. With Find Your Love, the second track produced by Kanye West on this album, I really like, and I think it's the only song on this album where Drake is actually able to combine strong vocals with an engaging beat and an engaging song. It's very clear that he's talking about somebody specific on his mind, and I think that this song translates really well, and unsurprisingly, it was the biggest hit on the album as far as pop radio goes. And I think it's aged really well. I think it's shown the direction that Drake has wanted to go with his career, and on every album that he's released, he's come out with songs that are very similar to Find Your Love in the sense that it does mix those strong vocals, those emotion-heavy lyrical content with with an engaging beat and something that's catchy and something that's easy to sing along to and something that's easy to be played on the radio. And that's something that he did very well on that particular track, but he certainly does better on a more consistent basis later on in his career. The closer to this album, Thank Me Now, I actually think is far and away the strongest track on the album. I also think that probably has the best beat on the album, the only song on the LP that Timbaland produced, but it's one of those beats that instantly draws you in, something that Drake didn't really have a whole lot of on this album, and Drake just spits two verses that are incredibly strong lyrically, and offer a lot more introspection than perhaps some of the other songs that he raps on about his confidence and state in the industry. Because while there is plenty of emotional introspection on the album coming from Drake, there hasn't really been, up until that point, a lot of introspection with him going deeper, talking about his career. It's just about how confident he is that he's going to do it. But in Thank Me Now, he finally digs deeper into talking about more of the intricacies of what it took for him to get big. And one line that I think particularly stuck out on that track was one where he was comparing rappers to athletes, and it was actually a very accurate and apt comparison that we could still kind of use today, where he says, damn, I swear sports and music are so synonymous because we want to be them and they want to be us. And there's a lot of those lines that really click in that song, and I really think that has really aged well and shown a unique mixture of very hard-hitting production and extremely clever lyrics, can't talk right there, extremely clever lyrics and introspection, talking about his career and how he got there and the confidence that he maintains while not completely stressing on how confident he is. So overall, I do really like this album. I think it's strong in a lot of ways, but at the end of the day, it ends up being more of a hit or miss LP if you're assessing it overall. Because looking at this track list, is really just like a roller coaster. It's up and down, starting from, you know, a bit of a slow start with those first three tracks, even though I really personally like the second track, Karaoke. Then the fourth, fifth, and sixth tracks, Over, Show Me a Good Time, and Up All Night, are all really strong. And then, despite finishing the album extremely strong, he ends up having another period of duds where you kind of have to try to pay attention to it. And I think that's the biggest issue with the album. I don't think that any of it is really explicitly bad or has been at any point in the album. I just think that it's not really as engaging as you'd like it to be. And that's certainly something that I do think, in retrospect, 8 years after this album came out, I think he's really improved on that in the later parts of his career. But at this point in his career, he seems like an artist that he was, one with a lot of potential, one with ambition to change the music industry, which I can safely say that he has done. But he didn't do it with this album, and I think that's something that really starts to take off with his next release. But this one certainly sets a tone for what Drake tries to do with his career and continues to try to do to this day, which is mix that emotional R&B appeal, mix his very solid vocals, especially in comparison to other rappers, along with, you know, a very good production team, very hard-hitting lyrics at times, and lyrics that can revolve around a number of different subjects. He's very lyrically versatile in that matter, that his subject matter evolves a lot beyond what you see on this album, which is mostly just girls and fame. But he certainly kind of expands that in his later works, but you can't give him credit for that here. So I do like this album. I do think that the strong moments on it are very strong, but there's just too many duds on it for me to really call it great, even though I happen to enjoy it quite a bit personally. So overall, I give this one a 67 of 100. I definitely enjoy it, but it's not something that I can say ages incredibly well in terms of content, but in terms of influence, it certainly set the tone for what would be more influential work from Drake in the future. But that's all I have right now. Thank you for listening to my first album review, and yeah, enjoy.